All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome this Friday afternoon to The Reason We Learn. I'm so glad to have my guest here. I have C. Bradley Thompson. You prefer to go by Brad? Is
Yes.
that better? Okay.
That works.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Great. So Professor Thompson is a professor of political science at Clemson University, where he teaches political philosophy. He's also the director of the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism and the founder of the Lyceum Scholars Program. And I have asked him here today because he's actually written in the past rather prolifically about education issues and specifically abolishing the public education system. He's also the author of his most recent book. I'm going to show it because I'm so enamored of it. It is the America's Revolutionary Mind, A Moral History of the American Revolution and the Declaration that Defined It. Great book. Everyone should buy it and read it. And when you do, of course, you'll become very frustrated with the fact that we don't teach any of this in our schools. But I want to talk to you about your position on abolition. First of all, explain to the audience what you mean by abolition when it comes to government schools.
Right. So I am a self-defined abolitionist, a position that I came to 10 or 15 years ago. I had not always been an abolitionist, but I sort of came to that position. I had been writing in the education sector at that point for a number of years, and was, of course, just increasingly appalled by what was going on in the government schools. And then an extraordinary thing happened to me. I read James Madison's famous essay, The Memorial and Remonstrance, which is probably the best defense of the separation of church and state there is. And I started thinking about it, the arguments that the philosophic arguments that he was applying to the question of government and religion. And then it occurred to me that in this essay, where he lays out 15 arguments for separation of church and state, that if you just go through it and change the word church for school or religion for education, it turns out the very same argument applies. The argument for separation of church and state applies exactly down the line to the question of education. So that was kind of an aha moment for me. Yeah. At the time, I was also working on, and I had just finished a book on abolitionist political thought. That is, the abolitionists who opposed slavery in the antebellum period of American history. And, it occurred to me that the abolitionists were, of course, completely right about the issue of slavery. But what impressed me the most about the abolitionists was that they were dedicated to a cause. That is, and the motto of the abolitionist movement was immediate emancipation, immediately begun. And they started this social, cultural, moral movement in the early 1830s, in 1831. And whoever could have thought it possible in 1831 that you could abolish the institution of slavery within 35 years? But that's precisely what the William Lloyd Garrison, who was the leader of the abolitionists, did. Mm-hmm. He led a movement to destroy this immoral institution. Correct. And then I would say the third prong was when I really started thinking about what government schooling is. It struck me that the same arguments that were being used against slavery could, in fact, be used against government schooling. The fact of the matter is, government schooling, and it's appropriate to refer to it not as public education, but as government education. It is education by and for the state. That is the purpose. That's why government schooling was created in the first place. And so it just became clear to me that that the single greatest problem with the government schools is that they are based on the initiation of physical force. That is, through compulsory attendance laws, and taxation. That's where there is direct and immediate compulsion. And then on top of that, as I suggested a second ago, it is education that has as its purpose the promotion of the state. Those were the primary reasons why government schools were created in the first place. It started in the 1850s, and then it took about 70 years for it to spread across the country. So that's, I guess, a general sense of how I first came to this idea of applying the arguments of the antebellum abolitionists to the question of slavery, and also applying Madison's arguments for separation of church and state. So in other words, in addition to being an abolitionist, you could also say, I'm a separationist.
Right.
I believe in the separation of school and state. And this is the principle which I think is in accord with the founding principles. Government education is not in accord with the principles of the American founding.
Right. And can you expound on that a little bit? Because a lot of people, I think, see public school as sort of axiomatic. You mentioned when we talked briefly before about Friday Night Football, they see it as part of the American story, public school and all this. And it actually isn't at all. So can you explain how that is the case so people sort of connect those dots?
Sure. So there was no formal government schooling in the United States until 1852, when it started in the state of Massachusetts. And then it took almost 70 years for it to spread across the country, east to west, north to south. So prior to its introduction in the early 1850s in Massachusetts, most schooling in the United States was entirely private. It was a combination of private schooling and homeschooling. Almost all of America's founding fathers were at some point homeschooled. And to the extent that they went to schools, they either went to private schools or they went to local community schools that were in effect they were home schools. That is, a school run out of somebody's house for a group of children in the neighborhood. So American history up until the 1850s was a history largely of private education. Now, it is the case that in some places, for instance, Massachusetts, even before 1852, there was, you could say, government schooling, but it was all at the local level. It was not run by the state of Massachusetts. It was not run even by townships. It was run by each town, and parents had direct oversight. They would pay a local property tax to support the local school, but those parents had complete control over what was taught in the school. They had control over who the teachers were. They could fire teachers on the spot. But what happened in Massachusetts, which is a kind of radical decentralization of education, that was not the case throughout much of the country. So the bottom line is, up until the 1850s, education in the United States was almost entirely free.
Mm-hmm. And I think people imagine that because of that, we were ignorant, illiterate, that until we had the government running schools, or that their impetus for it was to make sure everybody was, well educated. What was the real reason for the push to have government schooling spread across the country? Like in 1922, what was the justification for that?
Well, let's go back even further in time. Okay. Let's go back to even before the Civil War. And that's when the idea of government schooling was introduced into the United States. And it's very interesting. Where did the idea of government schooling come from? Where did the idea of government schooling that was adopted in the United States come from? Mm-hmm. Well, guess what? It came from Germany. It came from Prussian education. And so the leaders of the pro-government schooling education movement prior to the Civil War were all enamored with Prussian education. And they argued that the purpose of education was, in fact, to promote the state, the common good, and the state. And the more specific purpose of creating government schools, let's say in Massachusetts in the 1850s, was to turn Catholics into good Americans.
Right? As if you couldn't be a good American and be a Catholic, right?
Precisely. Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right.
Right.
So it was from day one, it had an ideological purpose. An ideological purpose determined by whomever was in power at any one given moment in time. So you could say, in Massachusetts, for instance, that some of the people who advocated for state education, you could say many of them were conservatives, old-time European-style conservatives, wanting Prussian-style education in the United States. But the fact of the matter is, they were the people who were running the government and the schools at that time. But the bottom line is this: when you establish a system of government education, that education will only be determined by whomever is in power at any given moment in time, right? And then they will try to superimpose their idea of the common good on everybody else. So fast forward to today, for instance. So if you are a secular liberal living in Kansas, you may not want your child being forced to recite the Ten Commandments in school. But if you are a Catholic conservative living in Massachusetts today, you may not want your child, your 6-year-old child, reading Heather Has Two Mommies. Right? The point being is whoever is the majority in any given state at any given time, or now even within the nation as a whole, whoever is in power will determine what every child in the United States should learn. And I'm entirely opposed to the idea that the government should determine the content of a child's mind. Right. I believe that's that is the role of parents.
Right. And then, what would you say to the parent to say, but then children will be taught wrong things, according to their opinion?
You mean like that doesn't happen today in the government schools?
Yes, that exactly. But that's what I hear. I hear, when you just mentioned the two different kinds of parents.
All right. So here's the way that works. Some small percentage of children, 2% of children, will learn, quote unquote, the wrong thing from the perspective of the other 98%. Versus what you have now in the United States is 90%, or it's really more like 88% of all children are all forced to learn the same thing through the government school system. And the question is, how has that worked for everybody, right? How has that worked academically? How have reading scores in the United States or math scores in the United States, how have they done over the course of the last 50 years? Have they been going up or have they been going down? And the answer is they have been going down steadily year after year after year, both relative to American students in years past and relative to students in other countries, right? The American education system, the government school education system, it's not failing. It has failed. It has absolutely failed. It is an abomination what we have done to the minds of our children in this country, between the ways in which we do not teach our children how to read or to calculate or to learn their past. Right? We now live at a time when the reigning intellectual ethos in America's government schools is to teach children to hate the country in which they were born. So I'd like a conservative, please, a conservative defender of the government schools to tell me why all of what I've just suggested is bad is actually good. Right. And I'd like a conservative out there, please, to tell me why, after 70 years of conservatives trying to reform the government schools, why they have completely failed. And given that fact, why do they think they can succeed in the future?
Right. Like I still see people arguing for legislative solutions, and they'll say, well, we have to do it locally. We'll just elect a new school board, but they don't understand the compartmentalization now of the system. Bureaucracies have a tendency to build their own protections. And in the last 70 years, they've done a fabulous job of that. The only thing they've been effective at is building their own protection. And it is not, there are now so many layers to, a person I know on the inside, a whistleblower a whistleblower told me it's like the Tootsie Pop. How many licks does it take to get to the center of the Tootsie Pop? You got so many things to get through, and you're just bouncing off, no matter what you try. Also, the school has become the center of cultural life in America, which it did not used to be.
Right.
And what do you see as a downside of that? That people are looking to the school for all things. All the social life of their child from 6 to 18 revolves around this government entity.
Right. So what you have now in the United States is parents dropping their 5 and 6-year-old children off to the local government schooling installation. And when you do that, when you drop your 5-year-old off on the first day of classes of kindergarten, what you are doing, in effect, is you are saying goodbye. You are saying goodbye to that beautiful little child that you have been raising for the last 5 years, and you are turning that beautiful child over to the government. That is what, in effect, you are doing, and you are thereby ceding your moral responsibility to educate your children. And so we can talk about what the schools are teaching, but you've asked the question about the culture, right? So one, we're having the schools babysit our children for 12 years, well, really 13 years, right, with kindergarten. In addition to babysitting our children, which is in effect what they are doing, but of course it's worse than babysitting our children now, because almost every government school in the United States, right, has armed security guards, in some places armed teachers, and they have cameras built into closed circuit television monitors in some schools that go directly to the local sheriff's office. You have barbed wires in some schools. This is what you're dropping your child off to. And then, of course, there is the moral chaos that reigns inside every government school in the country.
Yeah, explain that, because I really don't believe that parents are understanding that component, although they understand so far the academic chaos and that scores are going down, and there's a lot of people really dialed into that. But I'm not sure they're understanding the moral chaos and what you mean by that.
Well, sure. I mean, just take the obvious indicators. Pregnancy rates in middle school and high school students, suicide rates, drug use, alcohol abuse, etc. And not to forget, of course, the sex. Right. I mean, there was an extraordinary documentary done after the 1996 Olympics about a community, an upper class community in the suburbs of Atlanta, and it was extraordinary. A group of seniors were organizing orgies from school. At the house, at one of the mansions of one of these kids. But the point being, it was being run out of the school. And you would get 10, 15, 20, 30 kids skipping school every day and going to this one guy's house. And they were literally having orgies in this particular house. Mm-hmm. So, I mean,
there's that side of it. And then there's also the moral chaos in their minds, in a sense of what is right and what is wrong in basic human interaction. So we now have, cancel culture, for example, or, there's no forgiveness. There's no, there's no way um, to decide how to judge someone else's behavior objectively. So that's been torn apart. So we have this feelings driven culture where I think the way you wrote about it is, if you're, a stronger person in grade school, you sort of rise to the top and can almost become a bully or, a narcissist, because you realize there's a pack mentality and you're going to be the leader of that pack. And then everybody else is just the little, the pack members vying for position in the pack and being really cruel, almost Lord of the Flies level cruel. And even if they don't come to blows in the literal sense, the viciousness of the attitudes and the rhetoric and the judgment is not based on anything objective. So for a kid who's just trying to get through the day, they're unmoored. They can't decide what can I say, what can I not say, and at the level of anxiety must be intense, because you have no standards against which to measure your own behavior. Did I do right? Did I not do right? Well, I don't know. They're going to decide tomorrow, and then they'll change their mind the next day, and so on. And that can create that's the kind of moral chaos in my view too.
Without question, right? And so you could say that the reigning intellectual moral orthodoxy in America's government schools is moral relativism. And that's just simply a fact. You only need to look at the curricula of schools across the country and what's coming out of the so-called education schools, that is the teacher training institutions, and it's all moral relativism. That is to say, there are no moral absolutes, and it's a kind of moral subjectivism. Everybody, each and every individual has their own moral code, which we cannot judge as good or bad, better or worse. We have to accept everything. And of course, in that kind of world, what often happens is that everything redounds to the lowest common denominator. So in most schools, and this is not just true of government schools, I think it's true of many schools, including private schools, is that the moral culture always finds, it's like water, it always finds the lowest point. It finds the lowest common denominator. And one of the arguments, for instance, that is commonly used against homeschooling is that homeschooling doesn't adequately socialize children. Well, that raises several interesting questions. First, whoever said socialization was a virtue in the first place? And then secondly, one primary reason not to send your kids to a government school and to homeschool them is for the negative socialization that takes place inside the four walls of today's schools. And then I guess the last thing I'll mention, this is a huge topic, but I'll just mention it in passing. I'd like an answer to the following question. How is it and why is it America's 14-year-old boys are going into their local schools and committing mass murder?
Right.
Now, the fact of the matter is there's always been teenage violence in American society, but that violence almost never occurred inside the schools. But then starting in the late 1990s, you had a wave of mass school shootings, which has continued up until just the last few years. The mass shooting in Connecticut and then the mass shooting in Florida just a couple of years ago. Nobody's asking another question, is why are they committing mass murder in the school? Like, right. Why not somewhere else? Why not at the local, park or baseball diamond or roller skating rink or the places where teenagers hang out after school? It's never occurred to anybody to consider the possibility that these boys are, in fact, at least in part, targeting the schools themselves.
Right. Occurred to me.
Yeah.
I look for all the common denominators, and that was the one that jumped out at me first. Why is it at school? Why does the whole summer go by and they just put murder on hold? I mean, if it's guns, if it's video games, if it's whatever, there are 2 months there that they're not doing anything. Why do they wait till school starts again?
Exactly.
Strange.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, in my view, the government schools are corrupt beginning to end. So, another way of sort of answering your first question, Deb, is I believe that the government school system is the single most immoral institution in the United States.
Right.
And it's immoral for reasons in part that I've already suggested, namely, it's based on the use of compulsory force through compulsory attendance laws and through taxation. But more fundamentally, it's about using the government to fill the minds of children with the ideas that the government thinks it's important for children to have, thereby violating the rights of individuals.
Right. And there are people right now who absolutely believe and will say it out loud without hesitation that parents do not have sovereignty over their children, that the state is the right and proper entity to have that they would actually like to outlaw all private schools if they could, but definitely homeschool. I mean, every year at Harvard, they have this conversation. And thankfully, we do have some precedent with the court that makes it, protects it a bit. And homeschooling is fairly entrenched. So they'll say, well, homeschooling is too entrenched to really get rid of it, but let's regulate it like crazy. And I see a lot of buy-in on that also on the conservative side. Well, we can't have kids learning wrong things. And, there should be regulation. And what if a stupid parent? What if an abusive parent? There's so many what ifs. And as you said, why aren't you asking the what if questions about what goes on in the school? Why do you assume that the credentialed teacher knows what they're doing when they design the credentials? The government designs the credentialing process. They design the education process and the testing, all of it, soup to nuts. And we know because we've encountered teachers who probably wouldn't be intelligent enough to work at the post office, never mind to teach our children. And not to denigrate postal workers. I'm just saying, they shouldn't be our teachers. And I think people keep focusing on control. I keep hearing people want a measure of control over education, like they're just not comfortable with the free market, like with this idea of liberty when it comes to education. I honestly don't understand it except to say that the schools have been so effective that they have indoctrinated a sufficient number of people for a sufficient number of generations that this is a given. Of course we need to control what goes on in the minds of children. We just want it to be these ideas and not these ideas. And how do you think we can encourage Americans to get their mind back? The title of this broadcast was, have we lost our mind? And I didn't mean it in a pejorative sense. I meant in the sense that the way we think as Americans, we used to have a can-do, liberty-minded sense about us. Even if we did buy into some regulations here and there, I think when I was a child, even the average Democrat was like, I don't want the government on my back. And now it's like, more, please. How do we deprogram in order to do this?
Right.
How can we?
Yeah. So, that's the $64,000 question. And I've been thinking about that question for a long time now. And I'm not entirely sure I have the right or the full answer to it. But there are certain things that can be done. So a number of years ago, I put together a plan for abolishing the government school system. And it went through 3 phases. And the first phase was to start at the top of the hierarchy. So the first phase was to abolish the federal Department of Education and abolish all taxation associated with the Department of Education, and to abolish all national education standards, for example. Second phase would then be to abolish state departments of education, and also to decertify the so-called ed schools or teacher training institutions. And then finally, down to the third level, and so I'm sort of imploding political education power from the top, namely the federal government, down to the states. And then after you've abolished it at the state level, then you take it down to the local level, where schools would be community owned. But then over time, as they were, 250 years ago in Massachusetts, and then eventually move away from local public control or government control of education to a free market, a totally free market system of education. And I would encourage your listeners to again, just ask some very simple questions that will help you to think through this process, because I do understand and appreciate the fact that for a lot of people, including conservatives, that they have so much psychologically, emotionally, and even financially invested in the government school system that it's hard for them to break away from it. But let me ask the conservative listeners in your audience this question. Would you want the government to control Sunday school? And I know not a single one of them would. So if you're not willing to have the government control Sunday school, why would you be willing to let it control school Monday through Friday?
Right.
And there's almost never a good answer to that question.
Right.
So
if the answer comes back as some version of to prevent some other bad thing, like child abuse or the kid not learning to read, that's so many pieces of evidence now to point to and say, and they failed, and they failed, and they failed. It's like, meanwhile, if we take a look at the free market options, from homeschooling on through some private schools, not all, of course, but we see better results, happier, healthier, better adjusted kids. And to compare them side by side, I almost feel like we need to do that more. We need to help people visualize these differences, whether it's infographics or a film or something, so people can really begin to see what they don't have. Because I've spent a lot of time blackpilling people, telling them the negatives and talking to people like you about how it's failed and what's immoral about it. But I also want people to see what they're going to get. The gains, the things, the gifts they could so easily give their children that don't cost a lot of money, that don't cost a lot of time. And in fact, I think public school requires more time, because if you end up with something that needs to be remediated or psychological problems, you're talking big money, big time, and big anguish. But when you are choosing, when you have choice, it's almost like the world is your oyster. What would you like to see for your child's education? And I want people to understand that this is a positive change for you and your family. This opens doors for you. This gives you freedom to do things as a family, individually. Even if you worry about your work, work it around your work. People think of education as schooling, but schooling and education are not synonymous. And just because they take it up an 8-hour day, Monday through Friday, doesn't mean you have to. So I want people to start to see the benefits as well as the negatives they have to see. Otherwise, they won't understand the cost to exit is much lower than they think, and the cost of staying is much higher than they think. But what you get on the other side, right? And you're seeing college students, you teach college students. What are you seeing? And this may be too close to home, and if you don't want to answer, I understand. But are you seeing anything coming in that shows you the difference in how kids were educated before they arrive at Clemson? Is there a difference that you could perceive?
Well, I can say that there is a difference that I've noticed over the course of the last 30 years of teaching. And I do need to be and want to be delicate.
Right, of course.
I love my students. And I'm talking about a career that started long before I was at Clemson. But I guess one of the biggest things that I've noticed would be, first, the young men. There has been a dramatic decline in the intellectual engagement of young men almost every single class I walk into, every semester that I teach, on that first day when I walk in, where are the young men sitting in the class? They're all sitting at the very back with their baseball caps, on and turned around, and showing very little interest. And there's, all the young women are sitting at the front with their notebooks out, ready to take notes. That's the first thing I've noticed. The second thing I've noticed is just how much more emotionally sensitive they are. And it is absolutely the case that woke culture is a real thing on college campuses. It's created a kind of Maoist-like atmosphere of intimidation that is felt particularly by professors. I don't experience that myself here at Clemson. Clemson's a very different kind of place, much better kind of university, I think. But I follow trends around the country, and there is increasingly a kind of totalitarian atmosphere on American college campuses where student Maoists are haranguing and intimidating and threatening not just other students, but professors and administrators. So this is not a good time to be in American higher education right now. And then I guess the last thing I would say is that the students I see coming into my classes today, one, they know very little history, either American or European. So almost every class has to be remedial at the very beginning. And secondly, and I've started noticing this in the last couple of years, more and more students come in thinking that the United States of America is by definition an immoral, evil nation.
That's gotta hurt. I have so much trouble with that. I've traveled all over the world, and I lived abroad, and I visited East Bloc countries when they still were East Bloc countries. I stayed in a student dorm overlooking the wall in Berlin, and the searchlights and the goose-stepping soldiers and all of it. And I didn't go there thinking anything negative about my country, but I can guarantee you I still kissed the ground when I got home. It's so hard for me as a child of the 70s and 80s to hear that. It actually physically hurts.
Yeah, no, believe me, I feel your pain, as a former president said. And I mean, there's a famous story just from a month ago of a young woman from North Korea who escaped North Korea.
Yes. I saw that with Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, and eventually made her way to the United States. Phenomenal success story. Got into Columbia University, and she is now she now says that Columbia was more intellectually stifling, more totalitarian, I think was the word she used, than the education she got in North Korea.
Wow. It's hard to fathom. And usually coming out of the mouths of people who tell you they're all about tolerance and diversity,
of course,
and inclusion. And of course, words don't have meanings anymore, and so on. So, so what, I'm trying to think of where to go next. So you said that you put together the plan for abolition, but then, as I understand it, I mean, life takes its turns, and you didn't do anything as far as other than write about it, which is great. And I wanted to ask you, I've now read the articles that you've shared with me. Where can my audience see those things? Are those published somewhere? Are they on your website? Because I really want everyone to read those articles, each and every one of them, because we can't do it justice here in this short time together. And I think any one of them would be mind altering for a lot of people. But if they read all three, it's going to be really helpful. So,
right. So those articles are, I think they're mostly behind paywalls, so
Okay.
It would be hard to get them.
Okay.
So the essay on the new abolitionism which I've got it right here. The subtitle is "Why Education Emancipation is the Moral Imperative of Our Time."
Okay.
And then the second essay is titled "Education in a Free Society." Both of those essays are published at the Objective Standard magazine.
Okay.
I'm not positive, but I think they are behind a paywall. The other essay that you've referenced is titled "Our Killing Schools," and there is a very short op-ed version of that you can find online. But the longer essay was published at Society magazine. I believe that's also behind a paywall. However, if anybody in your audience would like a copy of any one or all three of these essays, they should email me or private message me on Facebook, and I will send them a PDF.
Okay, we're not done, but I did want to just like make sure we got that out, because I thought they were so good. So here, this is your website, and I think this is how I communicated with you. So, you know, if you want to reach Professor Thompson, you can go here and choose the contact, and you can send him a message to get those. And I cannot recommend them enough. They are really helpful, so well written. You're going to get all the history that he's been talking about. But I did still want to, if you've still got a little more time, I hope,
Sure.
I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of it. So when people hear things like abolish this and abolish that, and then they say, well, how are we going to do it? You're not really focusing on that piece. You're focusing more on the changing the minds of people, because that then changes. Like what I get out of reading your book about the revolution is that you first have to change what people are talking about, change what people are reading, change what people are, you know, socializing around, you know, in their community. And it does take time, but you first have to change your own mind, one mind at a time. You know, that if more and more and more individuals are holding certain ideas and then also teaching them to their children and so on, while it is slow, it took, you know, what, 35 years to get rid of slavery. So it might take 35 years, but it's such an important cause. Like you said, the abolitionists said, begin it and, you know, completely go into it. I don't want people to be discouraged by the fact that they can't have it next year. You know, it's not going to happen in 10 years probably, but that's not the point. You know, your child is going to be in school for 13 years, first of all, if you put them in the system. The damage likely will be done well before year 13. Okay. So would you agree with me that the first thing you do is get your kid out of it?
Yes.
Just pull your individual kid out of it so that their mind is protected, and then set about creating your alternative pathway. And my theory is the more people do that and start propagating the ideas that support that alternative path, the bigger the alternative path gets, and the other system begins to atrophy, or, you know, it has a harder time justifying its existence. So then these other changes will be easier. And I see parents as very powerful in this respect, and I'm trying to convey that. Do you agree with my thinking on this, or do
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I'm sure you and your audience have been following in the news over the course of the last 4 or 5 months the parental reaction against critical race theory in the government school system, and it's been wonderful. I followed this very closely, and I've very much enjoyed, you know, watching these parents, just ordinary, everyday Americans, going to the local school board meeting, which is filmed, and making these extraordinarily powerful statements against critical race theory, and that they don't want it being taught in the government schools, and they don't want the government schools teaching their children about LGBTQ, transgender issues, and it's been wonderful to watch it. And of course, at the same time, a number of Republican state legislatures have started passing laws banning CRT from the government schools. I don't support governments banning anything from the schools because I don't support the schools, but that's not the major point. and these parents, I love what they're doing and I support what they're doing. But if they think that the parents or the state legislature can ban CRT from the government schools, they're on a fool's errand. It will not happen. They will teach it anyway. And it's already happening. I mean, the government schools in a number of places, in a number of school districts around the country, have been developing programs to smuggle in critical race theory by another name.
Right.
And if every single teacher who teaches, let's say, history has been taught in an education school, right, which they're almost all required to do, this is all they get.
Well, and it's not that they're saying, well, I know this other history, but I'm not going to teach it. I'm going to teach this. They don't know the kind you and I know. They literally don't know it to teach it. All they know is America's a bad place, and let me tell you these non-facts about it.
Yeah, that I think that's exactly right. And so, but here's the bottom line. The government school system cannot be reformed. It cannot be reformed.
Right.
That is a fact. It cannot be reformed. And even if it could be reformed, I wouldn't support it. The schools would be better, sure, but they would still be immoral for the reasons I've already suggested. But the bottom line is they can't be reformed. Now, the 3-part plan that I've laid out to your audience is, it is somewhat theoretical, maybe pie in the sky. And it does depend, as you suggested, on something happening before that. And that is, there has to be a kind of nationwide moral intellectual revolution. But you can't have a moral intellectual revolution against the government school system that is educating 88% of all the children in the United States. So it's a very difficult thing. So something very curious has happened, which I think is, well, let's just say it's interesting. And that is the rise of homeschooling. So up until 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 2% of all children in the United States were homeschooled. That number over the course of the last year, largely because of COVID, has gone up to 11%. And interestingly enough, Deb, in the African American community, homeschooling over the last year was at 16%.
Yeah, disproportionately high relative to population. Yes.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. So here's the bottom line. And this really now is what I'm pivoting my argument a little bit from where it was a few years ago. And I'm now promoting what I call the walkaway movement. It's time for ordinary, everyday American moms and dads to start pulling their kids out of the government schools. And it's happening, right? Yeah. Enrollment in the government school system in every major school district in the country is declining significantly in very statistically meaningful ways. And so I want that trend to continue, right? And so what I would say to the members of your audience, I mean, I don't mean to come on too strong and too heavy here, but what I'm about to say, I believe to be true. You have a moral responsibility to your children to take them out of this corrupt system and to either put them in a private school or to homeschool them, because their education is your primary responsibility.
Yes. So, and the great news is that a lot of parents are now doing that. Right. And now the free market part, and this can be our last piece, and I think we'll wrap it up with a bow. I think it'll be perfect, because you had in your the second article about the abolition movement, you talk about the free market and how the free market is the only way to support education in a free society, that's the only way to do it. So can you give the audience some examples of what you mean by the free market? Now, we know about private schools, okay? Right. We know about homeschool, but what might people not know about or understand about free market and education?
Right. So let's just think about this hypothetically. Let's just say in Brad Thompson's ideal education world, over the course, let's say, of 10 years, we slowly, gradually abolish the government school system in one way or another. And we now have tens of thousands and then eventually hundreds of thousands of, and then millions of families pulling their children out of the government schools so that they basically collapse in on themselves. Obviously, the question then is, then what, right? How would a free market deal with education? Mm-hmm. Well, if the free market were in control of education, it would introduce things into the education market that have not existed in this country in over 150 years, namely competition and most importantly, just liberating the entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we've had an education monopoly, a monopolistic system of education in this country for now, well over 100 years. Mm-hmm. And in a monopolistic system of education where there is no competition, what kind of innovation do you get? You don't get innovation. And the fact of the matter is, there has been no innovation, very little innovation in the United States over the course of 120 plus years. We're basically still educating children in the same way that we did before, only worse.
Right.
Right? So if you introduce freedom and competition and entrepreneurship, what you'll see, of course, is that education entrepreneurs will see that there is a massive demand for education. There will be an explosion in the creation of new private schools. Existing private schools will expand. Every church in America will open its doors and create a school. Every major corporation in America will probably, Apple or Boeing, for instance, probably start running their own schools. And does anybody really think that Boeing couldn't run a better math and science program?
Right
for 15-year-olds than America's government schools? Right? Because I can tell you this, the people that Boeing would have as teachers teaching math and science would not have gotten their degrees from a teacher training institution, an ed school, where they have courses in bulletin board design. Right? They would have people teaching math and science who actually have degrees in math and science. You would also see an explosion in tutoring services. Kumon, for instance, tutoring services and Kaplan tutoring services would expand, would blow up. Parents would form local neighborhood schools, right? Look, right now, the single biggest problem, I think, is that parents in this country have lost the confidence in their own ability to figure out how and in what they want their children educated. Yeah. But freedom is a great elixir to inspiring people to actually think about how they want their children educated. Right. And I'm the optimist. I believe that ordinary, everyday Americans can rise to the task of finding ways for their children to be educated, and educated in ways that are massively superior to the ways in which they are educated today.
That we always have. I mean, in the period between the Civil War and the First World War, what kind of country did we build? And we didn't have coast to coast public school. And yet we still had a literacy rate that was extremely high relative to the rest of the world, and across different classes too. So in other words, it wasn't just the elite that could read. And now we're seeing people who are in the elite who can't read. So we've gone backwards. We've literally decomposed in a way.
Regressed. We have
We've
regressed.
regressed, but I like decomposed because it feels like what's happening.
And that too.
Yeah. So I think I'm like you. I have hope. I certainly at least have hope for each individual child. I know that everyone I know who has taken that first step and walked away or run away has gotten in touch with me and said, I didn't realize how much freedom I would have. I thought it would be harder. It's actually easier than I ever thought. Why didn't I do this long ago? You mentioned that you homeschooled your children, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And did you have a similar experience of like a little bit of trepidation at first and then, wow, this is so much better than I ever thought it would be kind of thing?
Absolutely. So my wife and I homeschooled our children for 18 years. We started when the oldest was 4. And it was, of course, as it is for every single family, it was an experiment. And we began with great trepidation. And, this was at a time when there wasn't really very much on the internet in terms of resources for homeschoolers. So it was a different time than it is today. And my wife and I had a deal, and the deal was she would just do it month by month. And so at the time we had a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a baby. And after the first, and so my wife's first responsibility was to teach the 4-year-old how to read. And so she did a lot of prep work on learning how to teach phonics or use the phonetic method to teach children how to read. And then she started teaching our 4-year-old how to read. And it turns out if you use the proper method to teach children how to read, which is the phonetic method, it turns out teaching kids how to read is quite simple. Right. And so after 2 or 3 months of homeschooling, I asked her, do you want to continue? And she said, yeah, let's do it through the end of the year. And then at the end of the year, I asked her, do you want to keep going? And then 17 years later, she finished.
Right. And your kids are all, I mean, not to pry, but your kids are very successful, right? I mean, so that's the other thing I'm trying to get across to people is there are all kinds of definitions of success, but I'm trying to raise happy people, happy, responsible, responsible, like they can do things. That's what we want. We want to launch our children, right?
Yeah.
Whether they end up making a lot of money or not, that's if they're happy and they're capable of paying their own bills and taking care of themselves. That's what I think every parent wants. And I feel like getting in touch with that again will help people make the decision. That we sort of reflexively go, well, you're 7 now, time to go to school, instead of thinking, what's the project I'm working on here with this kid? What do I want them to be when they're 18? Well, I'm not looking for them to be a lawyer. I'm looking for them to be a happy person.
Right.
Hopefully. So, and I just think this is nothing's a guarantee with children, but I think this gives you the best shot at it. And it is an experiment. You can be flexible and change things as you go, right? I bet you made some changes as you were going and then, well, we're going to switch to this. So, this one needs more of that. And that one needs, and also I bet you had, because you had 3 children, you probably discovered that one wanted to just keep going with something and dive in deep and go with it. Another one was like, do. I mean, most parent families have differences in their kids of how they want to learn things. So yeah, you can do all that.
Absolutely. And, through most of our conversation this afternoon, Deb, we have focused on the negative. Right. But I would love to finish on the positive. Yeah. And I'd like to say this as we come to the end of our time. And that is, without question, the decision to homeschool our children was the single most important and the best decision that my wife and I have ever made about anything. It's the one thing in my life that I would absolutely not change. And, we created a beautiful life for our family. I mean, I think we gave our kids a good education, but even better than that, we had a beautiful home life for 18 years when the kids were still all at home. And it was I mean, I just couldn't think of my life having been any better than it was because of homeschooling. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience, and I understand that not everybody can do it, not everybody wants to do it, and that's fine. But if you're in any way inclined to do it and you have the opportunity to do it, I would highly recommend that people do it, and I'm pretty darn sure you won't regret it.
Yeah, I completely agree. As a parent who was forced to stop homeschooling against my will, and I had to take my kids to a place I knew was bad for them by court order, literally, I can attest to that. It's a terrible feeling. And as soon as I could get them out, I did. So I want everybody else to take advantage of it if they possibly can. And to those who need support, or whether it's moral support or technical support or whatever, that's also what I'm here for. That's part of what this channel is about. I have a locals community. You can contact me and I can try to help you. But I also want to make sure that I throw it up again for you to get in touch with Professor Thompson if you want to find out about these articles that he's written. They're fantastic. I highly recommend that you read them, share, get other people to do the same. The Substack, which you should subscribe to, is the Redneck Intellectual on Substack. It's excellent. And I don't know if it's the most recent. I think it's still the most recent. The one about Dumb and Dumber is fantastic. It has many examples in there of curricula, pieces that are problematic. I hate that word now. I used to use it. Now I don't want to use it anymore. And the book is America's Revolutionary Mind. Highly recommend it. And when's the next installment coming?
Of the book?
Yeah, the constitutional, or we can have
America's Constitutional Mind.
Yes.
I'm working on it. Okay. The last two chapters are going slowly, but I might have it done in a year. Would be my hope. And then usually it takes another 9 months to get it published. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, if we're still allowed to speak, if I'm not at the gulag, maybe you'll come back.
I'd like that. And let me also mention to your audience that I will be doing a lot of education writing at on my Substack.
Okay, that's here.
Yeah, so I write as the Redneck Intellectual, but the URL is cbradleythompson.substack.com.
Okay, I can't spell. Bradley.
Bradley Thompson, all one word.
At Substack?
.substack.com.
Okay, C. Bradley. Make sure I'm spelling this right. All right. There we go. C. Bradley Thompson.substack.com. Okay, yeah, there it is. Subscribe.
That's it. Yeah. And so I will be posting, I think once a week, a regular feature called Dumb and Dumber, which is exclusively on education, both K through 12 and higher education. And then over the course of the next couple of years, I'll be publishing on a semi-regular basis long form essays on education. So I would say the Substack now is the place to go to see my most up-to-date writings on education.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Well, I cannot thank you enough for spending this time with us and sharing all of your wisdom with my audience. I do think educating the parents, educating the adults, even taxpayers who have grown children, because they might have children or they just could join in this effort to, do something entrepreneurial. If you're a retired scientist or retired, mathematician or even just engineer or something, you have something to offer. This is going to be a huge effort and you can do something. If this is important to you, if you want to preserve your own liberty or just the Republic, do something about it because you can. And I thank you so much for joining me. And thanks everybody for coming. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.